Hey, it's Lucy Litch, and this is Tiny House Conversations. It's the Australian-based podcast where I interview experienced tiny houses, tiny builders, and adventurers in the tiny world so you can discover how to create, build, and transition into tiny life. Hey, it's Lucy, and welcome back to another episode of Tiny House Conversations. Today I'm speaking with Anthony Smith, who is an environmental engineer and the founder and director of Wally. He's also a wastewater management specialist for the Australian Tiny House Association. And Anthony was on the show back in episode 15, talking all about composting toilets and greywater systems. And because this is such a big topic in the area of wastewater management, I've asked Anthony to come back on the show to dive deeper and sort of take a different turn than what we did in the last episode. And in this conversation, we talk about the importance of assessing your situation, needs, and variables before landing on any solution. The 3 areas to consider when navigating what kind of tiny toilet or greywater system is right for you. The potential limitations and impacts of a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to tiny house builders offering off-grid wastewater management packages. In what situations an absorption trench for greywater management may not be the best option. We also talked about the current situation with wastewater management regulations and lots more. Now, Anthony's been a really big help for me when it comes to navigating my own situation around composting toilets and greywater for my tiny house. And I've talked with him many times offline, and you'll often see Anthony at the Tiny Homes Expos educating all about these important areas of tiny house living and off-grid living, really. So let's get to the show and onto this tiny house conversation with Anthony. Anthony, welcome back to Tiny House Conversations. It's so good to have you here again today, and thanks for being here.
No worries, Lucy. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, pleasure to have you back. And, you were on the show back in episode 15, so it's been a little while since we've last spoken, and I've, asked you to come back on the show today because I know that when it comes to composting toilets and greywater systems, that those are some of the most commonly asked questions in the tiny house space, especially when people are beginning and maybe transitioning into tiny life. And I think those 2 topics could have, podcasts of their own, and we could speak about them for hours. So I wanted to have you back to sort of dive a little bit deeper today than what we did last time, and really sort of talking about them in a way of what you've seen and observed just being part of the tiny house space, what you've noticed over the years, and just sharing some considerations and principles and even some simple solutions with people. And also just giving them some guidance on how to navigate these 2 areas for their tiny home. But before we dive into all of that, it's probably been a couple of years since we've last spoken, since episode 15. And by the way, if you're listening to this episode, I'll put a link in the show notes at tinyhouseconversations.com if you want to go back and listen to our first conversation. But do you want to just fill us in, Anthony, on, what's been happening with Wally since we last spoke? I understand that you're, taking a little bit of a different focus than when you were on the podcast last time. So anything you just want to fill us in on about what's going on?
Probably when we spoke last time, I would have told you that Wally as a business was an ever evolving thing, and things have evolved more since then, or changed, I guess. It would have been, when we did last speak, a focus of Wally was around, it was a mixture of things, but it was partly I was, I guess, making a living out of selling different composting toilets, greywater systems. I think a sort of business model that I was working towards or around with Wally was a bit of a one-stop shop, about having an understanding of all these different off-grid types of wastewater management products, and not just products, but methodologies, and being able to offer the most suitable methodology or product for a given situation. And part of that was, from a business point of view, was selling certain products. And long story short, over the years, and especially including my involvement with the tiny homes industry, and in particular the tiny homes expos that I was involved with a lot, and still am a little bit. Well, I started to realize that my experience, my background, and the time that I spent in this space, in this off-grid wastewater management space, was quite unique. And where I'm going with all of this is I started to realize that it was my advice, my understanding in this space that was of most value to people, much more so than the products that I was selling to make a living out of. It was realizing that a consultancy sort of approach was working better for me from a business point of view, but also I was realizing that it was working much better for the people that I was, the clients that I was working with, rather than being sort of stuck with certain products that we were trying to fit to a certain situation. It was, hey, let's just talk about the bigger picture and be able to draw from all of my experience and point people in the right direction in a consultancy service. So that's where Water Wally's at the moment. Is its website's still always a thing in progress. Certainly, the focus of Water Wally as a business is in consultancy. But yeah, like I've talked about with you previously, Lucy, I've actually had a bit of a change of life direction as well, and I'm now living in Victoria in a remote off-grid location in the Victorian high country. So, and living and working at an amazing adult education facility called Wollongara. So the reason I'm telling you this is that the Water Wally, yes, is still a consultancy service that I'm sticking away in the background, but yeah, it's not my main focus in life at the moment. Well, in terms of work, anyway.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that update. I think the consultancy piece is a really interesting one, and it's also an important one because it very much relates to what we're talking about today, is that there's no one size fits all when it comes to composting toilets and grey water systems. And the reality is that every single person, whether they're living in a tiny house or somewhere else off grid in a different type of dwelling, one situation to the next is not going to be identical, and one composting toilet to the next grey water system setup is not going to be necessarily the same as the next person. And so I think we'll dive more into that today because, you would see it a lot and probably get questions about it a lot. And I do too, and I also see it, but it's like things like, what composting toilet is everyone using? What grey water system is everyone using? Which one do you recommend? And all of that. And it's not as simple as just saying, this is what I use, and so therefore it's going to be applicable to you, or it's going to be what you need in your situation too. So I just wanted to sort of frame that because it will be a big focus on sort of the lens that we're looking through everything that we're talking about today. So I guess whether it's tiny toilets or a grey water system, can you just start by talking about how people can consider approaching these things, and also the importance of assessing your situation and maybe any variables about your situation before landing on a specific solution?
It's a great place to start, and really that's been one of my biggest learnings working in this space and doing sort of more educational type, including the presentations I've been doing with the tiny homes expos and the sorts of people that I'm talking to that are in these varying situations. Is, I reckon, the biggest take home message is do your homework, or I mean that's a pretty fluffy way to put it, but do what you can to get an understanding of what the options are in terms of wastewater management in a tiny home, what variables might be applicable to your situation, and from there try to make hopefully a more informed decision around what is the best way to go, what is the best wastewater management system solution for your particular situation. And you're right, there is no one size fits all, and there are quite a few variables to consider. It can be a little bit confusing, and that's again why I've found there's such value in trying to give people the right advice. Is with a little bit of understanding and a little bit of the right advice, you can really save yourself a lot of money, a lot of trouble, a lot of heartache, a lot of potential dramas into the future. It can save a lot of drama, essentially, if you get things right from the beginning and make the right decisions from the beginning.
Absolutely. And with those variables that we just spoke about, like just generally, are there some examples that you could share on what some of those variables could be? Let's say if we're talking about tiny house toilets in general, even before we go to the composting toilet piece, it's like actually figuring out what those variables could be, whether it is the right route to go to a composting toilet or maybe some other type of tiny house toilet situation.
Yeah, well, I can give you some examples with the disclaimer that every situation is different, so these can only be examples to hopefully paint a picture of things that you could start considering. It's actually been a little while since I've done one of these presentations at Tiny Homes Expos, but I'm thinking back to the way that I've tried to present them to a crowd of people. When like you might be talking to say 100 people, how do you give these specific examples or how do you give examples without it being too specific and people going, oh, that doesn't apply to me. So what I sort of tried to do is to simplify things as much as possible, and really you could simplify things into three main areas of variables. Firstly, you've got the tiny home and its people. That's variable number one. Like we need to start at the beginning. The tiny home itself, and let's give some specific examples. How big is it? Does it have toilet, laundry, bathroom, kitchen, all of the above? Or let's say one example, which is not uncommon, is maybe it doesn't have a laundry, or maybe it's more of a weekender type of thing. It doesn't have a kitchen. So those are things that will impact the wastewater that's potentially produced, and hence will impact what the most suitable wastewater management system might be. Another specific example might be, is this tiny home connected to a town water supply, or is it standalone? Does it have, say, tank water supply? And where that might be relevant is if we've got a limited water supply, we might, it might favour more water conserving wastewater management systems, such as a waterless composting toilet, for example. And when I said I said factor number one or variable number one is the tiny home and its people. When we talk about the people, how many people will be living in the tiny home? That's going to be directly related to how much waste or how much volume of wastewater is produced. Is there people living in it full time? Are we talking about a temporary solution, or and temporary might mean 1 month, or temporary might mean 2 years, or are we talking about this thing's going to be here for a long period of time? Those are factors to start with, to get an understanding of that before we even consider what's going to be the best wastewater management system. We want to firstly understand what are we working with here. Next variable would be the site and soil conditions. And now, look, this is something that can play a massive role in deciding on what's the best way to go, best wastewater management system for your given scenario, your given site. And essentially, without going off on too much of a tangent here, we're essentially in almost every scenario utilising or using our site and soil as part of our wastewater management system. So, having an understanding of what we've got to work with is obviously going to be a valuable thing. Two things to mention about that is, one is we want to understand the limitations of our site and soil conditions. And again, just to give some examples around that would be, let's say we've got a high water table. That might impact what we can do. That could be a limitation. Or maybe we're a certain proximity from a waterway, a creek line or something like that. That might be a limiting factor. Again, just a couple of examples. But on the flip side of that, so essentially there we're looking at the limitations. You could almost say we're looking at the bad stuff. But the flip side of that is having an understanding of our site soil conditions can really work in your favour and be of good value. And one example of that would be, let's say we've identified maybe this little spot over here is a bit of a heavy clay, or there's a high water table there, or whatever, and that spot's not great. But over here, we've got a nice deep loamy soil. Again, just using examples here, maybe it's got a nice loamy soil with a high PRI, a high nutrient retentive capability in the soil. And then we can go, great, that spot, that piece of soil, that piece of land right there has got really great natural wastewater management capacities. We can utilize that without needing to consider some of the more expensive high-tech wastewater treatment systems, because we've identified we've got a great wastewater treatment system naturally occurring on our site. So look, we could definitely expand on that, but just to introduce that as one of the variables, your site and soil conditions. And then the last one, I mentioned there was three. The last one I would say which plays a big role is state/local government regulations. And look, that can be an interesting one. We could go off on a tangent with that too, but certainly as a starting point, understanding, for your own benefit, understanding what the regulations around on-site wastewater management might be in your particular area. And then also on from that, trying to get your head around of those regulations, those rules and regulations, which ones actually apply to your particular situation. And I can't remember if I've mentioned this to you before, Lucy, but I know it's one of the bits of advice that I reckon people get a lot of value out of, is just knowing that when you are, or if you are, going down that path of seeking local government support, approval for what you're doing, it really pays to work with the people that you need to work with and keep them on side and be respectful of their role. Like, it can be a frustrating process, 100%. Getting the shits on with someone, no pun intended, is not going to work in your favour. We could certainly expand on those three factors a lot, but just to answer your question and to introduce them, those are the three factors: the tiny home and its people, the site and soil conditions, and the rules and regulations.
Yeah, and I love those three pieces, because I feel like that's actually just, you speaking on those three pieces now has provided so much information in just a short space of time of how people can actually start to consider things that they may not have even thought about. Instead of asking that question, what's the best composting toilet? It's like, well, what are all these different variables going to be in my particular situation? And then, with the Greywater government stuff and the council stuff that you mentioned too, you can definitely see that with tiny homes in general and the situation with councils and the big grey area and the sort of lack of legalisation, let's say, or regulations of tiny home long-term living, I think that the Greywater and wastewater piece is a big part of that, right? It's like, actually, that's one of the things that they're most concerned about. And because every council is different and every single situation is different too, with a tiny home on the land, that there's just so much to consider and so many I always talk about it in being like just so many moving parts. And I'm curious just along these lines that you've been talking about now. So, say, for example, if we're sort of thinking about the tiny house and its people, the site and soil conditions, government council regulations, that type of thing. If someone was to go the path of installing a system that's not necessarily suitable for their situation, are you able to let us know like what some of those potential impacts could be of setting up a composting toilet or any kind of toilet, tiny toilet, or a greywater system that doesn't suit their situation for people to consider some of these things?
Yeah. Uh, Again, obviously, it's a variable thing, but look, I see it very, very often, particularly now that I've really with Wally focused on the consultancy side of things. Generally, I find that the clients that I work with sort of fit in one or two camps. One is they're really the sort of people or person that wants to really inform themselves and make sure that they're doing things right from the get go, and certainly there's massive value in that. I know very well that doing things that way can, like I mentioned before, save people a lot of money, a lot of mucking around, and make and set things up from the beginning. And then the second camp is people that have gone ahead and done something or installed a certain system, and then are having troubles in one way or another, and then they call on some advice on how do I fix this problem. And I guess to answer your question around, what are some of those problems that people come across, it may be that, well, I can tell you, I know one of the most common things that, and this is an interesting one because we're talking a lot about composting toilets. One of the most common examples of oh no, I shouldn't have done that types of discussions that I have is around people that have just followed suit, just done what everyone else seems to be doing, and then realized, oh, hang on, this is not the best setup for me, or I could have, with a bit, if I had have, given things a bit more thought, I could have done things a way that was going to work better for my particular situation. And one really common example of that is, when we're talking about tiny homes, every situation is different, obviously, but one common scenario is someone putting a tiny home on someone else's property where there's an existing house. And if there's an existing house, there is going to be an existing wastewater management system. And, the amount of people that I've talked to that could have saved themselves a whole load of drama just by, rather than trying to have their own infrastructure to be, in inverted commas, off grid, with maybe a composting toilet or an incinerating toilet and a greywater treatment system or a greywater trench or whatever else. These can be really great, simple solutions given the right scenario. But the example that I'm using here is where people could have saved potential dramas with those systems just by connecting into an existing septic system, for example. And again, this won't work for every scenario. There will certainly be times when connecting to an existing septic system isn't feasible for whatever reason. Maybe the system itself doesn't have the capacity for it, or maybe there is challenges around local government regulations and connecting into that system. But certainly, look, my approach and my advice for people coming into this space, if you're trying to navigate through all the potential options, I would certainly 100% recommend considering and looking at the simplest options first. And one thing that I really find is hugely valuable in that is that the simplest solutions will almost always be the cheapest solution, and the most environmentally friendly, sustainable solution. So, yeah, there's going to be times where the simple solutions don't work for whatever reason. But if you approach it in that way and look at the simple solutions first and maybe identify, oh, hang on, this simple solution is not going to work because of this factor, then at least you know the factor that is the issue and can consider wastewater management systems that best navigate that factor.
I'm loving this conversation because it's giving people a way, instead of talking about the what, we're sort of talking about the how and the why, and sort of zooming out a little bit and making it more helpful for people. So I really love that you mentioned those things. And again, it just comes back to that reminder that it's not one size fits all, and there's so many different things that can go into finding the right system for you, whether it's a toilet or a grey water system. And I'm just curious, sort of coming back to that. Actually, before we move on to what I was about to say, you did mention the incinerating toilet there. I know that
Mm-hmm.
you and I have spoken about that really briefly offline a little while ago when I did a podcast on that, with bringing on a couple that use that as their toilet in their tiny home. And I guess, and this is not a question of, you know, talking badly about a certain system or whatever, but I'd love to just know from your perspective, in terms of from an environmental standpoint, what are your views on using an incinerator toilet? They can be helpful for some people in their situations. Like, for example, the couple that I'm thinking of that was on the show before, they didn't want to get into the whole composting side of things. And even though they understand the benefits of that, it's just something that it was a preference for them. And so that system ended up working out well for their situation. However, with the caveat knowing that it's maybe not the best environmental setup, but I'm just curious your thoughts on that setup. And again, it's not about bashing any kind of system. It's just like, what's the baseline here on, the environmental piece around that?
No, I totally agree. It's not about bashing any system at all. And like I know the guys that import and sell some of those systems and are great people and really honest and will tell you advice that I believe is honest and true. You can have that in mind, that certainly not across the board, I would say, but talking to certain people, you're going to get some really honest, great advice. And those guys that do the incinerating toilets included. There's pros and cons to everything. Like I said before, that's my approach, is to put all of the options on the table and go, right, this one fits me for whatever reason, this one doesn't. If you're going to ask specifically about my take around environmental considerations in the incinerating toilet, look, I'd say it's a bit of a weird one. Like, there certainly are more natural and environmentally sustainable ways to manage your shit than to burn it. We're either using fossil fuels such as whatever it is, coal powered electricity to then burn our shit, or the alternative is gas fired incinerating toilets, which also essentially, burn shit. So turn it from poo into ash. So from an environmental point of view, it's certainly not amazing. If you did a direct comparison between that and a composting toilet, which just utilizes naturally occurring processes, which, we've got microbiology at work transforming the poo into compost, which can be an amazing soil amendment, garden fertilizer, and all the rest of it, versus using a fossil fuel to burn the poo and turn it into ash. The composting toilet wins by a long shot. But having said that, there are certain situations that I've come across where the incinerating toilet makes a lot of sense. And I want to put another spin on that, is I can see, if we want to talk, I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here, But if we want to talk about environmental impacts, I can see the huge value in the tiny home movement in general. So if the idea of a composting toilet is going to put someone off the idea of going tiny, I'd say don't worry about that. The beneficial impact that you're going to have by downsizing everything else is more valuable than worrying too much about what toilet you're going to be using. So if in your situation or you've got a person that can't get their head around the idea of composting toilet and an incinerating toilet works better for them, great, go that way. When we look at the bigger picture, the environmental value in going tiny, I would say, really outweighs the potential environmental impact of, say, an incinerating toilet.
Yeah, there's so many other things that, say, one person would be contributing to the good of the environment by having a smaller footprint, less of an impact, maybe being mindful of water use and just the way of relationship with the earth and living on the land and having respect. And yeah, there's so many different things. And so I guess it's also not about being perfect, because that's sort of, I don't believe in that something existing. And if the situation of the toilets means that maybe there's a little bit more impact that they are having on that, but then elsewhere they're having less impact, I feel like, yeah, it's really got to finding what works best for each person or family or couple and their situation and sort of running with that. And so just to move on to what I was going to ask you before, and the spirit of what we're talking about today with not having one size fits all and considering your needs and your specific situation. So that question that I mentioned before, what's everyone doing for a composting toilet? What's everyone doing for a greywater system? What one would you recommend? So what could potentially be a better question that someone could ask if they were just genuinely looking for a bit more insight or, something else to look forward to on their path? Yes, consultancy is obviously a great thing, but just if it's just a general inquiry, if someone's just asking in a Facebook group or, reaching out and asking a question, what would be a better question they could ask? Maybe something that's more helpful. It's time to take a pause from today's episode. Have you found any kind of value, inspiration, insights, entertainment, or education from listening to Tiny House Conversations? There's a simple way you can support the show, which I'll share with you in a moment. A big reason why I create the show is to serve you and to help make tiny living easier and more accessible to people. You may not even realize this, but bringing you the show week after week includes many, many hours of research, interviewing, production, editing, creating video clips, show notes, graphics, and much more, which I do as a labor of love. Not to mention podcast hosting and recording software fees, the website, and more. So to help make it sustainable for me to keep the podcast going long term and bringing you more awesome guests, tiny tips, experiences, stories, behind the scenes, expert information, and more, you can support the show by buying me a coffee. Just head over to tinyhouseconversations.com/coffee. And if you believe in reciprocity like I do and you want to say thanks and pay it forward, thank you so much in advance if you choose to support Tiny House Conversations in this way. All right, let's get back to the episode.
I reckon the better question would be, what's the best wastewater management system for my situation? If you can explain to someone a bit about your situation, then you may get some advice from someone who can help you or can help point you in the right direction. From your question, my concern around what I'm seeing happen too often is that people aren't asking that more general question around what's the best wastewater management system for my situation. They're jumping straight in to what's the best composting toilet. And, that's making a pretty wild assumption. Maybe that person asking that question has already done a lot of homework and has considered lots of options and has realised that composting cullet is best for them, and they're just trying to find out what's the best one to go with. But yeah, I certainly see it happen all too often that, like I mentioned before, people are just following suit. And that is one of the challenges in the tiny home industry currently, especially in Australia. It's a growth industry. As an industry, it's finding its feet. One of the biggest challenges we have around the tiny home movement is regulations haven't caught up with what's going on. So the impact of that is that there is no well set out relevant rule book around what to do with wastewater management in tiny homes. And that leaves people vulnerable, to either be, unintentionally doing the wrong thing because they just don't understand how all this stuff works, or even, being misled by, and look, the reality of it is it's a commercial world. So there are wastewater management system suppliers that will be happy to say, yeah, this system's great for your situation, without that necessarily being true. And there's no regulation to fall back on for the guidance around, hey, which way do I go here? It leaves people a little bit vulnerable, like I said, and hence there really is that value or that need to have an understanding, have your own understanding around what your options are before going in and landing on a solution. Yeah, it's a tricky one. One of the things is regulation. And another thing that I find is interesting and relevant around regulation is, and I touched on this before, being respectful to people in that regulatory roles, people that are responsible for trying to ensure that people are ticking the boxes and doing the right thing. The tricky thing there, especially in a tiny home space, is that the regulations have caught up. And I mentioned that before. And what I mean by that is the regulations that exist around wastewater management in general are really solid. They're well researched. There's good science and good, experience around what works and what doesn't and why. And those regulations are set out for good reason. They're set out to protect public health and the environment. That's a great thing. That, those regulations, the aim or purpose of those regulations is a good thing. Where it falls down a little bit in the tiny home space is that the regulations that do exist were written before tiny homes were really a thing. And so what the result of that is it's not scalable. So the principles around the regulations are great. The purpose around the regulations is great, but we can't currently with the regulations that do exist scale that down to suit the small scale stuff that people are doing in a tiny home. So it's a tricky one. You almost get stuck in that spot where you have a choice of either going rogue, going under the radar and disregarding the regulation, and then you're vulnerable where you could potentially be doing the wrong thing by the environment, or you could be installing a system that's not right for you, or maybe is going to work for a couple of years and then fail because it wasn't suitable for your particular site. Or you make the choice to tick the boxes and comply with the regulations. And often the outcome of that is that you end up with a system that's over-engineered, just bigger than what you'd need for most tiny homes. So there you are. That's where we are currently. Regulations, I think, will change over time, and I think there's the beginnings of regulatory authorities recognizing this issue and trying to make changes to make tiny home living more accessible, but it's a long way off, I reckon, anyway.
It's a common thing that I keep hearing now. I think you're the third conversation that I've done in the last month where we talked about the council side of things and tiny homes, and the wastewater management thing has come up as well. Speaking to Faye from the Tiny Homes Expo the other week, and then Paul Dolphin, who is a sustainable building designer down here where I live, and he deals with
Mm.
council a lot and getting approval for different dwellings and things. And both of them, as well as what you've just said, is very, very similar vein in that there's been these regulations and guidelines in place for a really long time. But because tiny homes is just growing at an exponential rate, those regulations, like what you said before, haven't sort of caught up to what's happening now. And so we're finding ourselves in a place of, because there's so many things to consider and there's so many different situations, and all these old guidelines, it's like, actually, how did the council do that? And there's a lot that goes into that. How do they update them, and how do they manage for a broad spectrum of situations and a broad spectrum of contexts? And I don't even know what the answer to that is. And so I do understand, even though it's like, why is it so hard? I do also understand why, how it is such a big job to get on the same page with the councils and to have them catch up to what's happening in tiny houses. So yeah, I'm very, very curious of what's going to sort of unfold in that space. I think especially over the coming 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, maybe even 5 years, But I think it's going more towards that. And what it seems to be is it's a situation of coming from tiny house people are just moving into tiny homes, and sort of that's a way that we're pushing for change. In some ways, we're just doing it anyway. And obviously, hopefully, in a responsible way. I can't speak for every single person that's living in a tiny home, but hopefully, in a responsible way, particularly with the Greywater and the Blackwater, because that is something that is a concern, one of the main concerns, that they're wanting to make sure people are just doing the right thing. And I guess just on that, related to what you were talking about with the regulations and things, I know that you're working with ATHA, the Australian Tiny House Association, and that your role is the wastewater management specialist, and that they do have a specific guide for that. So do you want to let us know a bit more about that?
It's a free downloadable guide/resource from the ATHA website. I would assume that most people listening to this podcast would have heard of ATHA, the Australian Tiny House Association. They're, in a nutshell, advocates for the tiny home movement, the tiny home industry, and are trying to do what they can as a volunteer organisation to make some changes and make tiny homes more accessible in general. And yeah, I came on board, it would have been almost a couple of years ago now, to offer, my background or my inputs to ATHA around, this challenge with wastewater management in tiny homes. One thing that I've done for ATHA is develop this tiny homes wastewater management guide. And it's actually been a little bit of a challenge. It's a long story and I won't go into it. But essentially, what we landed on was quite a simplified document that really just outlines what your options are. And that, it really is a good starting point to go to understand, okay, here are a list of options. And then from there, it's really a matter of considering those variables that we talked about initially, the tiny home and its people, the site and soil conditions, and the local government regulations or state government regulations, and playing a bit of a balancing act. And I forgot to mention that previously when we were chatting around those three variables. It really is a balancing act. You really are just going to go, okay, we're going to find the solution that's best for the tiny home and its people without considering the other two variables. Sometimes you need to compromise on one of those variables to find the best overall solution. An example of that might be a composting toilet for this particular scenario is great for the environment, and it's great for the site and soil conditions. And it, in this example, ticks boxes for local government regulation, but the people living in it don't like the idea or don't want to. Let's use a specific example. Maybe elderly or aren't able to manage their compost themselves, and that might be a factor. And so then we play a bit of a balancing act, going, well, yeah, it ticks all the other boxes, but maybe in this example we're gonna consider other options because it doesn't quite tick that box, if that makes sense. It's a bit of a balancing act between those three variables to find a solution that fits best overall. So that was where we got to with that ATHA wastewater guideline, was really just to give a brief outline of what all the potential options are, a quick description of what those options are essentially, and then from there it's a matter of looking at your own particular scenario and doing that balancing act.
Yeah, and I can put a link in the show notes at tinyhouseconversations.com to that guide if anyone wants to go and download that. And I did do a podcast episode in season 1 with the ex-president of ATHA, Janine. So it was episode 50 something, can't remember the exact number, but I'll put a link in the show notes as well at tinyhouseconversations.com if you want to go back and listen to that. And just a couple more questions for you, Anthony, before we start to wrap up. So just around what we've been talking about today, this one size fits all thing is not necessarily helpful. Quite a few tiny house builders these days that we're seeing put these all-in-one off-grid wastewater management packages together for their clients. And, I know the intention is to try and be as helpful as possible, maybe try and save them a bit of money and just have everything all together so that when they go and set their tiny up on site, like they've got it all right. But what's the other side of that? What could be some potential impacts or limitations that may not necessarily serve every client that goes down the route of having that package all together?
Again, it's a tricky one. I totally agree, and I've actually talked to many tiny home builders around this topic, and I totally agree that the intention in most cases is good. It's all about trying to really help. In regards to tiny home builders, it's them wanting to help their clients find solutions and not leave them hanging and say, here, we can build a tiny home, but you got to go and do your own wastewater management, not our problem. People are preferring or wanting to offer a solution and say, hey, here's a tiny home that's ready to go. Unfortunately, I really think it's a bit problematic. And it goes back to, like what we've been talking about, there is no one size fits all. And I've come across it many, many times. I talked about it before, one of the two camps that my consultancy clients sort of fit into. And very often the people that come from that, I've got a system and it's not quite right camp. Those people have very often bought tiny home from a builder who's also provided an off-grid wastewater management package. And we can be a little bit specific here and say, one of the most common off-grid wastewater management packages is going to consist of a composting toilet and greywater management system of some description. And that is without considering many variables that we've sort of touched on. So yeah, I've talked to a lot of people that have gone down that path and been supplied certain package, and it's failed for certain reasons, or if not failed, it's been problematic. The composting toilet wasn't right for their particular situation because they were intending to move it in a couple of months' time, and that system is not right for the new location that they're going to. Or it might be, and probably a more common one is the Greywater, the Greywater, we've talked about this before, Lucy, is really a bigger challenge than the toilet, because the toilets, there's a range of toilet options, and they're relatively self-contained. I probably shouldn't use that term because that refers to a certain type of composting toilet. But what I mean is that most toilet units, composting toilets, incinerating toilets, etc., contain the waste in one way or another. Whereas Greywater has a lot more interaction, I guess is a good word for it, with the site and soil. So a certain package that you might have been provided might not be right for your site and soil conditions, or maybe it will be right for, and this is one of the challenges around just being provided a certain system. Maybe it's going to work okay for 12 months' time, but then the soil is going to become clogged because there wasn't the right sort of grease trap installed, as a specific example. The tiny home builder can sort of wipe their hands of, yep, we've done our thing and it worked for 12 months, but then you're left with, in 12 months' time, an issue that you need to deal with. Look, I'm just giving a couple of examples. Like I keep saying, there's a lot of variables to consider. But yeah, I see that specific idea around tiny home builders providing an off-grid wastewater management package as a bit problematic and potentially detrimental to the tiny homes industry moving forward. If there are cases where people are unhappy, if they don't like what they've been provided and it's not suitable for their lifestyle, they're going to be unhappy tiny homeowners. Or if what they've been supplied fails in a couple of years' time, and that's happening to other people around the place, that's going to be a bad look for the tiny home industry in a couple of years' time, where everyone's digging up their greywater trenches and having to replace them. Or maybe local government authorities are realising what people are doing and are picking up on the fact that the off-grid wastewater management package that's been provided doesn't comply with local government regulation, for example. There's a whole load of variables that are going to play a role, and that could make that one-size-fits-all type of package problematic.
Yeah, and it's reminding me of the value of, I think, customization, right? Because it can apply a similar thing to a solar system, and a lot of companies are doing similar thing too, just having, I mean, I have one of them, the solar trailer, right? And again, that's going to come back to so many different variables too, and how many appliances and how you're using the space, how often, how many people, and how much sun you get. So it's a very similar type of thing. And I'm seeing like, yeah, again, as you said, for the most part, you're usually trying to be helpful, but there can be some limitations at the same time when it's, rather than customizing, it's a one size fits all. And I think just it's a sort of a same reminder of just everything in life, really, that often it's, there's so much more nuance than there is sameness and one size fits all. And you just mentioned the trenches there, right? So one thing I wanted to ask you about is, because I think one of the most common things that I'm seeing and hearing, and I've done it myself for my own Greywater, that with the help of you and consulting with you before my tiny was being delivered, is to create an absorption trench. I got the local plumber that does earthworks to sort of do maybe a 20-meter trench or something out the front of my tiny, maybe a little bit less than that. But it is one of the most common setups that we're seeing with tiny homes, and I think maybe it's because it's a less complicated, let's say. I don't even know if that's the right terminology, but you can either do it yourself if you're handy, like that type of thing, or you could get the local plumber to do it. So I'm just wondering, and this might be again another tricky thing, and it could also be a loaded question or one that doesn't have a direct answer, but I think that's okay. When would an absorption trench not be a good idea for a tiny house setup? So like, what are a few contexts that might not be the best option, even though it seems to be one of the most common options out there for tiny house people in Greywater?
Yeah, I think running greywater into an absorption trench, given the right environmental conditions, is a really great solution. I mentioned given the right environmental conditions because there will be certain environmental conditions that would make that less suitable, such as, for example, a high water table. If you've got groundwater that's coming up to where your trench is installed, it's going to make that trench fail in a sense of, you're going to pull the plug out of the sink and the water's going to have nowhere to go. So that's, from a practicality point of view, the trench has failed. And also, if you've got groundwater at the level of your trench, then you're missing out on the wastewater treatment that would usually occur as the grey water passes through the soil. There's all these chemical, biological, structural processes happening as water passes through a soil profile that essentially treats the water. If your groundwater is right up where your trench is, you're missing out on that treatment. So essentially, you're discharging polluted wastewater into a groundwater table, which could potentially end up in, waterways and creeks and stuff like that. So, there's a couple of examples where it's less suitable or not suitable, but, there might be ways around that. There might be ways where we can go, actually, I was going to put the trench here, but there is a high groundwater table there. Why don't we incorporate a small pump well into our system, and we'll put our trench on the other side of the house up the hill a little bit. We're still utilising a very simple, natural, passive wastewater management system, with the exception of, we've incorporated a pump. Ideally, you'd want to do things without a pump and keep things totally passive, but maybe your site doesn't allow for that, and maybe implementing something simple like a pump well will be the solution. But I would like to clarify on that one there that certainly a small absorption trench works with what I mentioned before around looking at the simple solutions first. And if an absorption trench is suitable for your site, your situation, it is quite a simple solution, and it's a good place to start looking at how to dispose of / manage greywater on a site.
Yeah, that's super helpful because, again, that's something that, I see questions about all the time. And often that, as you said before, and we've talked about today, there are so many variables, but I think simple is always best. And I think you did say it also before, often it can be the most environmentally friendly too. Like, you might not necessarily need this big, fancy, expensive system. And you might just need, something simple like that. And I can attest that for my own situation, I've been here now for maybe 15 months, I want to say, living in my tiny, and had the absorption trench set up by the local plumber. And it's been great. It's been fine. And the trees that are right near it are, growing really well too. And the grass, once it was excavated, obviously it's taken off, like I've got clay and topsoil here. Took off a lot of that, but the grass has grown back. It's abundant. I've got wildlife around and all of that, and it's just worked out to be a really simple solution. And it's also one that I think that when I do move on, which I will be at some point this year, I've told you that the other day offline, that it's not a complex thing to have to then uninstall and, all the different things in a really huge way. It is much more simplified than, something else.
Yeah, just quickly, one thing that I reckon is really worth touching on there around running greywater into trenches is, in terms of longevity of said trench, that's where the value of, say, a grease trap or some sort of settling tank comes in. So, yeah, you could run your greywater straight out to a trench without any of that, and it'll probably work fine for a little bit. And then here's another variable: if you are only planning to be there for a month, maybe that's all you need to do. But if you're talking about living, staying there for 2 years, there might be value in incorporating a suitably sized greywater trench or settling tank. I find there's real value in all of these things to understand what's that for. And that grease trap or a settling tank, sort of the same thing, just a different term, is really all about capturing greases and other stuff so that it doesn't block up your trench. That's the real purpose of it. So in terms of longevity, if you're looking at doing a simple trench system, it's also worth considering a grease trap or settling tank suitable for your situation.
Yeah. And can those things be added later? Like if you don't initially put in a grease trap and you do have just the trench?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one limitation might be the way that your plumbing's been laid, the way that the pipes have been laid. But certainly, if those pipes are accessible, yeah, there's nothing stopping you from retrofitting a grease trap or something similar.
As we start to close out the conversation, Anthony, is there anything that you feel we haven't touched on that might be important to bring into the conversation just around everything that we're speaking about today?
I think there's heaps of stuff that we haven't touched on. So,
We'd be here all day.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, like we keep saying, the tricky thing is that there are a lot of variables. What's the answer? Like I sort of feel like sometimes having these conversations, we're almost just saying, there's so many variables, it's so hard. What do you do? Don't know. Hopefully that's not the take home message. Hopefully it's more around, yes, there are a lot of variables and there are a lot of different options to consider, and it shouldn't be rocket science. It should be something that you can do a little bit of research on and try to work towards the most suitable solution. I think there's a lot of value in doing things right initially. Although, if you learn something along the way, you ask the question, yeah, you can retrofit things and make things better as you go. But sometimes that can be, a costly, challenging thing as well. Do what you can to inform yourself around what the variables are in your situation, and also do what you can to inform yourself around the options that will best suit your particular situation.
I'm curious now that you have said there's heaps of stuff. I mean, I know that I don't want to open up a can of worms and like a whole, 2 hours more on the topic because we could go on forever, I know. But I am curious, like, if there are a couple of other things you wanted to mention, you're more than welcome to do that here if you have the time, especially for something that's sort of like important. And again, I do know that again it is tricky. There's so many variables. There's not a one size fits all. Like we know that. We know that. And sometimes I feel like it can feel like there's more questions that come up than answers when we're trying to answer these things. But I also think that, especially with some of the stuff that you mentioned at the start with those three pillars, right? There's actually a lot of really good stuff that people can use to consider their own situation. So I don't know if there's anything else you just wanted to add. You're welcome to.
Yeah, I reckon just to drive home that message of look at the simple solutions first. There's massive value in that. Utilizing existing infrastructure if it's available. There's huge value in that. You don't need to rebuild everything and start from scratch if there's something that you can use as a shared infrastructure. Look, I think it's an interesting thing, given the sort of current trend, to just say composting toilets aren't for everyone. They're not the bee's knees solution. They can be a really great solution, but don't go there first without considering the variables initially. And like I said before, that's one of the most common sort of, oh no, I've done the wrong thing. Clients that come to me is they've realised that a composting toilet's not the best situation, and they should have maybe used a flushing toilet and hooked into an existing septic system on the site or something similar to that. Given the current sort of trend around what's happening in the tiny home industry and the off-grid packages that the builders, etc., are offering, I'd say composting toilets aren't for everyone. They're a great solution, but consider your options before making a decision around which way you're going to go. that's for the benefit of the tiny home owner and the tiny home industry as a whole.
Yes, yes. I see with a lot of builders that just seems to be the sort of the assumed option of what you're going to get when you buy a tiny home. But I have seen online as well, like you're talking about people having certain systems and then finding that it's impacting them in some way or it's not. They got a self-contained one, but maybe they need to have a split system, or they got a split system and maybe a self-contained would be better. Or, like you said, maybe composting toilet overall is not something that is going to be right for every situation. So yeah, I think that's really great to highlight there. And do you want to let everyone know if they want to come and find out more about what you're doing with Wally, if they want to do some consulting with you? Where's the best place that they can come and get in contact with you and see what you're doing?
Come and check out the Wally website. There's links to consultancy session bookings and other general information on there. At the moment, it's a little bit of a hangover from an old business model. I need to do some work on the website. So there's the hangover of an old shop there, online shop, that doesn't exist anymore. Look, to be honest, I've been way less active in social media and stuff since moving out bush, but I still am involved in, I'll be at a couple of the tiny homes expos this year. There is the Off-Grid Living Festival, which may have already happened prior to the publishing of this podcast, but I'm still doing those types of educational workshop presentation type things. And the best place to find out about that is just good old social media.
So we'll put a link in the show notes for everyone at tinyhouseconversations.com. And yeah, if you want to work with Anthony, I can vouch for working with you, Anthony, because you and I have had many, many conversations over the phone prior to moving into my tiny house, while I've been living here, especially around composting toilets, greywater systems, and just navigating, finding what works for me. And it's been, you've been really, really helpful. So I'm very grateful for that. So, thank you for, being a really generous and helpful person with good intentions. And I think at this point, you're very well known in the tiny house space. And I know a lot of people, every time there's a tiny homes expo, I'm always hearing, your name, Anthony from Wally. And I think people often get a lot from the talks that you do and the information that you share, and even just coming up and saying hi and connecting with you. So thank you for what you do in the tiny house space. Thank you for your time today and, sharing so generously on the podcast. And yeah, just thank you for being here. And I always love chatting with you. So it's been great.
No worries, Lucy. Thanks heaps for having me. And it's been good chatting once again.
Yeah. I feel like it's a conversation that could just continue to go on and on and on because there's just so much here. I know. The rabbit hole, let's call it. So yeah, if you're listening to us at home, thank you so much for being here with us, and make sure you go check out Anthony, Wally, the Tiny Homes Expos. Again, those links will be at tinyhouseconversations.com, and keep an eye out for new episodes of Tiny House Conversations on Thursdays, and I'll see you next week. Thanks again for listening. And if you enjoyed the conversation today, you found it valuable, and you want to support the podcast, the best way you can do that is to share the love. That way I can keep bringing you more tiny house conversations to help you on your own tiny journey. So here are 3 ways that you can support the podcast. Number 1, if you have a friend or family member that you feel would benefit from hearing these conversations, feel free to share it with them, email them, text them, send them a telegram, do whatever you need to do to share it with them. Number 2, if you hit the subscribe button, you'll know exactly when the next episode is live. And number 3, if you head on over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to podcasts and leave a 5-star rating and review. Thank you so much in advance. I appreciate you, and I'll see you in the next episode.